Last week, Moses was living a quiet life. As a husband, father, a shepherd, he spent his days safeguarding sheep and watching big puffy clouds float across the blue sky, perhaps daydreaming about the life of wealth and privilege he had lived as a youth, not wishing for it back, but remembering how his death as an infant had been decreed. He was the child of one of those dangerous outsiders, but was miraculously rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh, the one who decreed that death, and raised in the house of one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. But one day he saw an Egyptian beating a slave, and a righteous anger rose up inside him. And he identified with the suffering of the Hebrew people, and in response killed that Egyptian, which led to a cascade of escapes and events that found him years later living a quiet life as a husband and father, safeguarding sheep and watching puffy clouds across the blue sky. And one day, while minding his business, thank you very much, he saw a bush burning, but it wasn't being burned up. And you heard the rest of the story last week. With great reluctance, Moses accepted responsibility to go back to Egypt and demand that the new Pharaoh let his people go, as long as his brother Aaron could help him. And so, on their first day of work, which, by the way, Moses had just turned 80 years old, and Aaron was 83. This was their first day on a new job. They ate breakfast, they polished the leather on their sandals, and without an appointment, showed up at the palace of the Pharaoh. Like two tiny field mice, they pulled together the gumption and the moxie to proclaim, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they can hold a festival for me in the desert." Did you get that? They were smart. They didn't ask for the whole big, "let my people go forever." Just give my people a 3-day weekend. But from on high on that throne, the deep voice of Pharaoh let out a sinister laugh and ordered the slave masters to make things worse, much, much worse. Order them to make the same number of bricks, but give them no straw to make them. So on their downtime, they had to scour the land, gathering straw, and when they inevitably fell behind, the slave masters drove them even harder. Lazy bums, the Pharaoh called them. Work harder, harder. And the people were furious. They raged against him. Not him as in Pharaoh, but Moses. "Why did you come here? To make our lives even worse? You've given him a reason to kill us because we can't possibly keep up." And in turn, Moses was angry with God. "Why did you send me here? I've only made things worse. And you have done absolutely nothing to rescue your people." And God replied, "Watch me. Now go back to Pharaoh and demand that he let my people go and use the party tricks I taught you. That'll impress him." So they went back in front of Pharaoh, and Aaron threw his shepherd's rod on the ground, and it turned to a snake. Amazing! But Pharaoh called over his wise men and wizards, and they did the same thing. Wah, wah. But then Aaron's snake gobbled up the other one. But, Pharaoh still wasn't that impressed. And so the first day on the job, and they had already failed. And the next day, God told Moses and Aaron to find Pharaoh and tell him that if he doesn't let the people go for a 3-day festival in the desert, you will turn the water of the Nile River into blood. And the fish will die, and the Nile will stink. And Aaron held the shepherd's rod over the water, and it turned to blood. Amazing! But then the Egyptians were able to do the same thing. Wah, wah. And a second time, they failed to impress Pharaoh. Next, God said, "Okay, tell Pharaoh that if he doesn't let my people go for this 3-day weekend, frogs will cover the nation. In your palace, the beds, even in your ovens and bread pans, there will be frogs everywhere crawling up on you and on everyone else in Egypt. Pharaoh didn't seem to care, so Aaron raised his rod, and voila, thousands of frogs emerged from the Nile and went everywhere and got into everything. And Pharaoh relented. If you pray to the Lord to get rid of these frogs, I'll let you go for your festival. Third time's a charm. Victory. Moses got rid of the frogs, but not by having them hop away. They just died where they were, in the houses and the yards and the fields, and they were scooped up in big piles and began to stink. By the way, began to stink is the exact words from the Bible. But at least the frogs were dead. But now that the crisis was averted, Pharaoh changed his mind. So next, as God instructed, Aaron hit the ground with his rod, and all of a sudden, Egyptians were feverishly scratching themselves while the animals were rubbing up against trees trying to relieve an itch because they were covered in lice. But this time, Pharaoh's religious experts couldn't replicate the lice and told Pharaoh, this God has amazing power. And yet Pharaoh still wasn't impressed. So the next morning, Moses and Aaron repeated, let my people go for 3 days so they can worship God. And this time, if you refuse, swarms of insects will descend on you. And clearly Pharaoh didn't like bugs, because when he refused and all of a sudden bugs started swarming everywhere, Pharaoh waved his arms wildly and cried out, just go already! But you have to have your festival here, not out in the desert. And Moses responded, well, it's the desert or nothing. And while he's still swatting the bugs away, he said, okay, just get rid of them, and you can go. And so the insects all swarmed away, but as soon as they were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind. And Moses and Aaron were so frustrated. All of these signs and wonders, and not yet one sign of progress. And so they repeated to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they can worship me. And if you refuse, tomorrow morning I will send a deadly disease on all Egyptian livestock, but it won't affect the Israelites. Pharaoh laughed. But the next day he wasn't laughing when all the animals owned by the Egyptians were dead and all the Israelite animals were alive. And yet Pharaoh still wouldn't budge. How long was this going to go on? I mean, how much more suffering was Pharaoh willing to force on his people just to keep his slaves from a weekend at Burning Man? Well, we'll see. God instructed Moses to throw some ash from a furnace in the air in front of Pharaoh, and the ashes turned into soot that covered everything and caused blisters and boils to break out on everyone. And the religious leaders were so sore from the boils that they couldn't even stand to try to replicate the same thing, which I actually thought they had given up on a while back, but they were still trying. But the Lord made Pharaoh stubborn, and he still wouldn't listen. Wait, that's something new. We're 6 plagues in. They're wearing Pharaoh down. They're working. They're getting him closer to relenting. But God made Pharaoh stubborn? This is one of these great mysteries in these stories. But first, let's just see what else happens. So Moses and Aaron once again relayed the message, give my people 3 days off. And if not, the greatest hailstorm anyone has ever seen will devastate the land. Now, some of Pharaoh's officials were starting to get smart about this, and they heard that, and they quickly stepped away and raced home to protect their families. But of course, Pharaoh refused, and Moses raised his hand, and lightning began flashing, and hail started beating down on everyone and everything so hard that trees were shattering. And back at the home of the Israelites, a nice, gentle rain, like the rain we had in the day of the big hurricane. Pharaoh looked out at his nation being devastated and declared, I'm wrong. You and your God are right. Go. You don't need to stay any longer. And Moses breathed a sigh of relief, and Pharaoh breathed a sigh of relief, and then Pharaoh said, "Psych, no soup for you." And so next, Moses warned, locusts will descend and devour every last piece of vegetation left after the hail. Pharaoh's officials were breaking ranks even more and started speaking up to him and saying, "How long are you going to trap us in a corner like this? Egypt is being destroyed." And Pharaoh listened and realized Moses and Aaron had beaten him. "Okay, go, you won. Finally." But before you start rolling out the barrels, he asked him, "By the way, who is going to this festival?" And Moses said, "Everyone, young and old, and all of our animals." And Pharaoh suspected a ruse and added a condition to their release. You can go, but you have to leave your animals behind. And Moses countered that they had to take all of the animals so they were available for sacrifice, because they wouldn't know until they got there which animals they were supposed to sacrifice. And Pharaoh accused them of having an evil scheme, and so now he said they can't take women and children too. And they argued back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until Pharaoh got tired of it and called security and had them removed. So in the morning, as Pharaoh was eating his avocado toast, a locust jumped onto it and he swatted it away. And a little later, just as he went to take a sip of coffee, one landed in his cup and he spit it out and got coffee on his robes. And so as he's wiping away the liquid, he sees shadows and he looks up and he sees the sky turning black. And locusts started landing on everything and eating. The sound of it absolutely deafening, eating until nothing green was left anywhere, except where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh urgently called for Moses and Aaron. He cried out, "I've sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Please forgive my sin. Pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly disaster away from me." Moses left and prayed, and God turned the wind, and no more locusts. So now, yes, finally, victory. Not really, of course, right? Because the Lord made Pharaoh stubborn. God, what are you doing? And just then, darkness, like nighttime, approached, and it covered Egypt for 3 days, except where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh told Moses, "Get out of here. I never want to see your face again, because the next time you see mine, you will die." And Moses replied, "You got it. I never want to see your face again either." And on to a 10th disaster. God said, "Tell Pharaoh that at midnight the firstborn human and animal in every Egyptian household, including Pharaoh's, will die. And there will be a terrible agony heard throughout the land like never heard before. But not for the Israelites. Not even a dog will growl." And then the Israelites were told to prepare a lamb for supper and use its blood to put a mark on the doorposts and over the door. And in every Israelite so marked, home so marked, God would pass over. And then at the stroke of midnight, from the oldest child of Pharaoh to the oldest child of the prisoners in jail, all were dead. A terrible agony rang out across Egypt. And Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron that night and granted their request, and with sorrow added, "Please bring a blessing on me." But no time for a party. The people were urged to hurry and leave as fast as they could, because Pharaoh could change his mind again, right? Experience had taught them, and so they left so fast the yeast had not yet caused their bread dough to rise. And on their way out of town, they asked all the Egyptians to give them their gold and silver, and apparently so traumatized by all the death and disasters, they just handed everything over. Now, as they hurried away, God didn't lead them out of Egypt by the shortest route. That would take them through the land of the Philistines. And God, it says, was afraid that they would run back to Egypt if the Philistines tried to attack them. Not sure why God couldn't have stopped that from happening, but instead God sent them out a roundabout way through the Reed Sea desert. And the Lord went in front of them during the day in a column of cloud to guide them, and at night in a column of lightning to give them light. And they went as far as the edge of the sea and set up camp. And then Pharaoh changed his mind. Of course he did. What have we done, letting Israel go free of their slavery to us? And he summoned 600 elite chariots and all of Egypt's other chariots and the whole cavalry and army and chased them to their camp on the sea. The Israelites could see the dust rising. They could hear the Egyptians yelling, and they could feel the rumble of the chariots and horses beneath their feet. And they turned and were furious and screamed at Moses, "Weren't there enough graves in Egypt so that you had to take us out here to die in the desert? What have you done to us? You should have left us alone." Moses calmly said, "Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord pushed the sea back. The waters were split in two, and as the Israelites walked through, they just walked to the other side. As the Egyptians pursued after them, their chariot wheels gummed up in the mud, and in the morning the waters returned and covered up every last Egyptian. The Lord rescued Israel that day. And then Miriam picked up a tambourine and began singing and invited others to dance. "Sing to the Lord for an overflowing victory. Horse and rider God has thrown into the sea." You know, Miriam was the sister of Moses and Aaron. She was the one who asked Pharaoh's daughter if she would like Miriam to find a woman to nurse the baby Moses. She's the one who led the singing and dancing all day and all night. Pharaoh's chariots and army God has hurled into the sea. Your strong arm, Lord, shatters the enemy. Whew, long story. Took a little longer than I wanted. But I have a couple things. I have to say a couple things, right? Because it's not just a history story. It's a where does this apply kind of story. And I have to say about the God made Pharaoh stubborn. Sorry, I don't get the explanations that are offered, so I'm not going to torture you with maybe this and maybe that. And it's okay to not understand, but it's all the killing. I mean, it's one bloodbath after another. And then the horses in the sea, that wasn't necessary. I don't get it. And that's not okay. But to not understand is. Because to offer an easy answer doesn't require us to wrestle with such questions as taking sides in war, such as watching Confederates fall to the ground while black Union soldiers prevail. And what about mass suffering intentionally prolonged by leaders like Pharaoh for ego or for their enjoyment of cruelty? But here is what I know. These stories were told by people trying to understand their history. Not the facts about their history, but history of their relationship with God. And I think that if each of us were to tell the history of our relationship with God, it'd be a mixed story. People might find some of our conclusions confusing. If I were to say to you, God did this or God did that for me, you might look at me side-eyed and say, really? Throughout our lives, God changes, and who God is today might even contradict what we previously believed with such certainty. And thank God that God changes with us. But what doesn't change is throughout history, in whatever bizarre ways that gets manifested, God absolutely loves God's people. And who can fully explain love? And be assured, the story isn't over. Stay tuned. There's still more to come for the Israelites. And hear this again as well. You are God's beloved too. And there's more to come for you too.